What up, y'all? It's your hometown hero, the real Adam Coleman, coming to y'all one more again, man. So a couple weeks ago, I was, I told you guys that I was a part of this urban apologetics series, with Epiphany Fellowship up there in Philly. Shout out to them. Shout out to my man JC Jones. Shout out to Pastor Eric Mason for having me on with that. And the first installment that I dropped here on my channel was when I was doing basically a session on the problem of evil. So they had me back for another session, and this time I was dealing with Black Atheism and Skepticism, kind of breaking that down a little bit and giving some counter arguments to the atheist position. So y'all check that out. You definitely want to kind of watch the whole thing, because there's a lot of little nuggets in there in terms of just how atheism takes a particular shape in the African American context and some nuances in terms of how we can address that. So y'all check it out and drop some stuff in the comments, man. Let me know what you think. Peace.
This is going to be very, very important. We got Adam Coleman with us. In a minute, I'm going to turn it over to him and go ahead and let him start doing his thing. So this is brought to you all by the Surge Evangelism Ministry at Epiphany Fellowship. Surge stands for Sent for Urban Relevant Gospel Engagement. And so it's really just embodying this concept of being an urban missionary. So when we look at that word missionary, it means sent one. Jesus said in John 20:21, he says, as the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you. He said that to his disciples, sending them out into the world on a holistic gospel mission. So Jesus sending his disciples to take the whole gospel message that's concerned about souls and body on a whole mission to whole people and whole communities throughout the whole world. And that's what Surge is all about. And so we're doing evangelism. And as we're doing evangelism, we're doing apologetics, answering the tough questions, giving people reasons for our faith and our hope in Jesus Christ and the gospel as we unpack the gospel. And we're doing justice. So we're caring for people's souls and we're caring for their bodies as well. We're caring for their spiritual needs, and we're also caring for their earthly material needs, their temporal needs. So we care about their eternal life and we care about their earthly life. And so it's very holistic. And so we do justice, different outreaches we're going to be doing and things like that to care for people's physical, temporal, material needs here on this earth as we unpack the gospel. And that's why part of our name is that relevant gospel engagement, because in all of our engagement, all the outreaches we do, all the justice work we do, the gospel is at the center, Christ is at the center, because we want to see people come to faith. So that's the Surge Evangelism Ministry. And we're doing these trainings on apologetics because as you unpack the gospel, you got to answer questions. And these are common questions and objections to the Christian faith in the urban context, especially in the African American community. So we're doing these trainings and we want to make them very practical, accessible, and understandable for everyday believers. So we're not just, some highbrow ivory tower type of apologetics, but making it accessible for everyday believers. That's what we're about. Everyday believers should be engaging in evangelism and apologetics. So we want to bring it down to everyday believers. So again, good morning to you all. We're going to go ahead and get started. I see we got a good amount in the room. Again, go ahead and continue to share this on your pages, invite other people in. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Adam Coleman. I don't want to hold us up any further. And I think that this is going to just be an excellent presentation addressing the common objections that Black atheists and skeptics are raising to the Christian faith. And so without further ado, Adam Coleman, good morning to you, brother. You can go ahead and begin to do your thing, brother.
All right, man. Good morning. How you doing there, bro? I appreciate you. Thanks for having me here one more again. It's always a good sign when people invite you back, man. The first time you might just kind of luck up, but when people bring you back, that means you must have done a decent job before. So
you did your thing last time, bro. You did your thing, man. We got so much great feedback from last time. You did your thing, brother. So we're excited to have you back.
Excellent, man. Excellent. That's what's up, bro. That's what's up. So here's what I'm going to do, man. I did a run through of this presentation this morning, and I was getting a little tight on my time limit. So people who know me know that I'm not gifted with the ability to be brief. So I'm going to cut out some of the preliminary stuff and just jump right into dealing with Black atheism. Let me go ahead and set my time here, because if I don't, we're going to be here a minute. All right. Excuse me. Now, historically, historically, atheism has been culturally out of step, if you will, for African people, people of African descent, for the longest. I mean, even going back to before slavery and so forth. As a matter of fact, as philosopher John Mbiti puts it, Africans are, quote, notoriously religious. With the common feature of African religion, taking it that God is the ultimate explanation of the genesis and sustenance of both man and all things, end quote. This is held true as a characteristic of our community for Africans of the diaspora. So for those of us who are here in the Western world, typically, we believe in God as a community, right? Now, with that being said, I want to be clear that atheism is not an entirely new phenomenon among us. So, for example, going back to the era between 1916 and 1970, you have what's called the Great Migration. Where an estimated 6 million African Americans relocated from the rural South to the northern states, particularly the urban centers. Now, what's interesting is that accompanying this population shift, you have this artistic, social, and intellectual movement known as the Harlem Renaissance, that broke out in New York City, with residual expressions of it in other cities as well. Now, with that being said, Black atheists today would argue that challenges to religious thought were already present in aspects of African American culture, like the blues, for example, before this period. However, it's during the Harlem Renaissance that humanism and atheism found a louder voice in the works of individuals like Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, very popular, Zora Neale Hurston, even James Baldwin and some others, right? So it seems to be that the driving force behind this kind of rise in that voice for humanism and atheism is related to the frustrations that these folks have with the African American predicament, obviously racism, oppression, and so forth. Now, with that being said, nowadays there's a number of folks who hope to kind of take up the Black atheist mantle, if you will. I've got some on the screen like Dr. Anthony Penn there on the upper left, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I did Aries Spears. I did him the service of putting question marks around his name because even though he's articulating atheism in some of his more recent stuff, he says he's unsure. But then also you have Mandisa Thomas, who's a loud voice for atheism today, and as well as Sakibu Hutchinson. So, these are some folks that are using their public platforms to actively recruit for atheism, particularly among millennials, right? Got a little problem on my screen here. Excuse me. Oh, shoot. Oh, there we go. All right. Sorry about that. Had some technical difficulties. All right. So even, Black secularist organizations like African Americans for Humanism, for example, they've actually even made some inroads on college campuses, right? So atheism has gained somewhat of a silent yet growing cultural presence, particularly through individuals like a name like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who have not overtly forwarded the cause of atheism, yet they kind of maintain influence as thought leaders in our community. As a matter of fact, according to the Pew Research Center, the fastest growing group among African Americans today are what's called the unaffiliated. And these would include groups who say that, that they're just don't believe in anything in particular or hold to any particular religion, agnostics, and atheists. So it's not something that we can really afford to sleep on. You know what I'm saying? And unfortunately, I think that's what, much of us, many of us are doing. I think that too many of us in the African-American context still take for granted this conviction that we as a community have that, we believe in God. But we really need to be prepared to face the challenges that Black atheists bring to the table. Now, I want to say at the outset, I recognize that there's a lot of controversy. As a matter of fact, in the chat room, if you got some atheists in there now, they're probably already, chomping at the bit to challenge me on how I might define the term atheism. So I kind of want to make sure I'm defining my term before I go a bit further. But there is a bit of controversy in terms of how that concept of atheism is to properly be understood. Classically defined, atheism refers to the belief or stance that there is no God. That's classical atheism. Regardless of what people on the internet want to say, that's what it means, what it has meant classically speaking in the philosophical literature. However, many atheists today take exception to that notion, and they believe that it should be rendered as more something like lacking in belief in God or gods, right? Now, further, which kind of muddies the waters even a little more, is that you have a subgroup that would use the term Black atheism to mean something more idiosyncratic, if you will, which would be to denounce God as represented in the Abrahamic faith specifically. So maybe they don't denounce God entirely, but just in the Abrahamic faith, right? That would be somebody like, I've heard, like Brother Polite, for example, articulate something along those lines, right? So just for clarity's sake, so we're all on the same page, you know what I'm taking aim at here. When I use the term Black atheism or Black atheist, what I'm referring to is continental Africans and Africans of the diaspora who hold a worldview, perspective, etc., which includes or implies the stance that the statement God exists is a false statement. I'm gonna read that one more time. Continental Africans and Africans of the diaspora who hold a worldview, perspective, etc., which includes or implies the stance that the statement God exists is a false statement. So that's one element of what I mean when I use the term Black atheism or Black atheist, right? Secondly, Black atheistic perspectives are characterized by the culture and concerns of those communities. So it's kind of like atheism with like some soul food seasoning on it or something like that. You know, atheism with a soul food twist. So, for example, you know, where you might have your regular, you know, white atheists might throw the problem of evil at you, which we discussed last time. They may say something about natural disasters or people getting cancer, or maybe the Holocaust or something like that. Black atheists are going to have the same kinds of concerns, but they're likely going to frame it around something like police brutality or slavery. You know, obviously, you know, that's something that comes up all the time. As a matter of fact, just as a brief side note, I've actually seen some interviews with Black atheists where they talk about some of the conflict that they have with the white atheist community, because the white atheist community tends to not be concerned with the issues that are affecting the Black community. And so there's some tension there between the, you know, Black atheists and white atheist groups along those lines. It's actually pretty interesting. With that being said, to kind of hone in on where we're headed, two streams of critique, if you will, that you're going to find that's very common from Black atheists is going to be that Christianity or theism, as in, you know, the belief in God, Christianity and theism, they're basically irrational relics, if you will, in our community that we don't need anymore. Black atheists take it to be that, you know, our belief in God and Christianity is maybe traditional, emotion-based, you know, perhaps socially advantageous, but still not for critical thinkers and should be left in our communities past, right? So that's one thing. They believe that Christianity is irrational. Number two, you know, there tends to be like these problem of evil related and maybe moral critiques. Maybe we could frame it that way. So this would be things like associating the church with slavery and white supremacy, asking questions like, you know, where was God during slavery? Where was white Jesus? You know, or where was Jesus during slavery? That sort of thing. So you got this kind of critique from this standpoint of whether or not Christianity is rational, and then this moral critique. And these tend to be the two main, you know, streams of critique that you're going to see from the Black atheist community. Okay, so kind of framing that a little bit, we're going to move forward. All right. I'm still getting the hang of this computer here, so bear with me. I might be a little sluggish on my slides. Okay, let me say this before we go forward, actually, in response to the kinds of objections that I just mentioned. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of the tools that we're going to use to do so. Okay. So what we're going to be doing is taking a look at a couple of deductive arguments. Okay. Deductive arguments are tools to demonstrate that this tools that philosophers use rather to demonstrate that there's a good reason to affirm something or to accept something as being true. Okay. Typically they're formatted with a number of sentences or statements that are referred to as premises. And then the last statement in the series is going to be what you call your conclusion. Okay. So you're going to have a couple premises or statements, and then you're going to have your conclusion. And the idea is that the premises, you know, ought to, you know, flow into or support the conclusion that you're trying to draw somebody's attention to. Okay. Now, you know, you have a good deductive argument on your hands if the premises are more likely true than not, or more plausible than their negation. They're more likely true than not. And then secondly, if your conclusion follows or flows from your premises, then you know you've got what's called a sound argument. You've got a solid argument on your hands. Okay, so let's just try a little experiment real quick. I can't remember if I did this last time, but just for the sake of you know, those who may not have been here, we're going to do like kind of a practice syllogism, a practice deductive argument. Okay, all right. So it says premise one: Adam always wears blue jeans on Saturday. Okay, premise two: today is Saturday. Therefore, number three is our conclusion. Therefore, Adam is wearing blank today. Fill in the blank. You know, go ahead and throw it in the chat if you will. Right. Obviously, you know, I think it's pretty easy to see that, you know, Adam is wearing blue jeans. You know, it makes sense, right? If premise one is true, that I always wear blue jeans on Saturday, and it says Saturday, and if premise two is true, that today is Saturday, then you can follow the line of reasoning and get to our conclusion, which is premise 3. Therefore, Adam is wearing blue jeans today. Okay, that's an example of a deductive argument. Okay, so we're going to be using this again as a tool, if you will, as we explore the existence of God, the arguments for the existence of God. Okay. All right. One last thing before we kind of like really dig into our argumentation. All right. I want to get into our first argument, our first couple arguments, by introducing a guy named Zara Yakko. Zara Yakko. Okay. Now, Zara Yakko was a 17th century Ethiopian philosopher. Okay. He's indigenous to Ethiopia. And he was raised in a Christian community during a time where there was a great deal of religious conflict. Okay. Excuse me. Unfortunately, there was this kind of booming trade relationship between the Portuguese and the Ethiopians. And you had this conflict between the Portuguese Catholics that were coming into the country and the indigenous Ethiopian Christian community. Right. And unfortunately, that conflict swelled, to a pretty severe extent to where Zara Yakko believed that he was actually in threat of his life. He was falsely reported to the king for something he didn't do, and he ended up having to flee his home. And so he actually exiles himself for 2 years in the cave. 2 years in the cave, and in his memoirs, it says that he only takes with him a couple pounds of gold and the Book of Psalms, right? And so here he is in this cave for 2 years with the Book of Psalms and whatever gold he had. And he just spends that time really wrestling with some existential questions like, why is there evil in the world? What is the nature of morality? Does God exist? And so forth. Now, eventually, Yakko leaves the cave after 2 years, and he goes back to tutoring as he was before. And he was actually like a printer of books. Well, not printer, but he would copy books for people for money. As he's working, later on in life, one of his students that he was tutoring named Welda Hiwat, I'm sure I mispronounced that, but I think you got Vince Bantu coming up in a couple of weeks, so he can correct me on that one, but I'll pronounce it Welda Hiwat, authored a collection of Yakko's philosophical reflections that he had during that time in the cave, and that came to be called the Hatata. The word Hatata in Ge'ez means inquiry. Okay. Now, in chapter 3 of Yakko's Hatata, he describes that he had this crisis of faith where he's wrestling with the problem of evil, that we just talked about last time I was here. He's wrestling with the problem of evil, and he comes to doubt God's existence, right? But then applying the scriptures and some critical thinking, he comes to conclude that God does indeed exist. And he actually writes in chapter 3, gives a sneak peek, if you will, the arguments that led him to that conclusion. So we're going to take a look at that passage and then break down the arguments that he's using here. Okay. So I'm going to put that on the screen. All right. I'm going to just read this straight out. Okay. So this is from chapter 3 of Zara Yakko's Hatata. Okay. He says, later on, I thought of the words of the same David. He's referring to David in the Psalms there. He was reading the Psalms and reflecting on it. He says, later on, I thought of the words of the same David. Is the inventor of the ear unable to hear? And I said, who is it that provided me with an ear to hear? Who created me as a rational being? And how have I come into this world? Where do I come from? Had I lived before the creator of the world, I would have known the beginning of my life and of the consciousness of myself. Who created me? All right. Was I created by my own hands? But I did not exist before I was created. If I say that my father and my mother created me, then I must search for the creator of my parents and of the parents of my parents until they arrive at the first, who were not created as we are, but who came into this world some other way without being generated. All right. This is where he kind of brings the argument home. For if they themselves, oops, I think I went backwards by accident. Oh, no, it didn't. Here we go. Sorry. Okay, so if they themselves have been created, I know nothing of their origin unless I say he who created them from nothing must be an uncreated essence who is and will be for all centuries to come. The Lord and master of all things, without beginning or end, immutable, whose years cannot be numbered. And I said, therefore, there is a creator, or else there would have been no creation. This creator who has endowed us with the gifts of intelligence and reason, can he himself be without them? For he created us intelligent beings from the abundance of his intelligence, and the same one being comprehends all, creates all, and is almighty. Okay, that's the end of that passage there. Now, what's fascinating, here's a couple of different things, right? At the outset of his inquiry, Zara Yakko frames his arguments with three questions, okay? Three very interesting, or with a series of questions, I should say, with three interesting aspects, okay? In doing so, he sets the stage for incorporating three aspects of the natural world and human experience, namely order, rationality, and cause, into framing his arguments for God's existence. He seems to understand them as being three facts of reality that require a single explanation, right? So let's just take a look at these three questions right quick, okay? Where do I come from, right? That's the issue of cause right there. Now, obviously, he's not just talking about him as an individual, because you notice from the passage, he went all the way back to, basically the first material stuff that was created. He's talking about ultimate causes, if you will, okay? Secondly, he asked the question, who was it or who is it that provided me with an ear to hear, right? Now, there's a couple things going on there that we won't get into all of it, but in other portions of the Hatadah, where he associates, Zara Yakko associates function, as in how living beings or animals function, for example, or have parts that function in ways that make it possible for them to thrive in the environments that they do. Okay, so Yakko associates that function with the orderliness of nature, or the orderliness of the physical universe. In another portion, he also notes that there is a moral order to things, a universal moral order that we'll get back to in a minute. But for now, we'll just go ahead and move on to that third question. But he talks about two different kinds of order. I think I'm going to say it's in chapter 7 as well. Okay, so but for the third question, who created me as a rational being, and how have I come into this world? Okay, so let's get into that reason, that rationality. How is it that we have beings who have consciousness? Where does that consciousness arise from? Which is actually, interesting enough, is one of the more premier questions in the field of philosophy today, this issue of consciousness. I'm saying this is what you see him grappling with back there in the 17th century. Okay, so you've got cause, order, and reason, which we've got core. Now, what I've done is I've taken these insights and I've actually added a few elements and formed an acronym that we're going to be working our way through, or at least parts of, moving forward. Y'all see me there on the Michael Jordan thing? Y'all see what I did there? I'm not saying I'm the GOAT or anything like that. I was a bandwagon Bulls fan back in the day. So, all right. So the acronym we have is SCORE. Okay, I've kind of added a couple elements to Zara Yakko. And the first one, the S stands for signs that God exists, right? Because what we want to be doing is we want to be pointing people to the different signs that are in our human experience and in reality itself that point towards God's existence. And some of those signs are cause, talking about that ultimate cause, order, and then reason, as we just discussed with Yakko's big three. And I actually added an E, which is evidence for Jesus's resurrection. Okay. Now, what I'm going to be doing is I'm actually going to be just tackling the cause and the order part, particularly the moral order as we're moving forward. We'll just be tackling the C and the O there, if you will. Okay. When we get to the O, I think it'll be interesting. We're talking about the moral order, because some people may recognize a common moral argument that we use in apologetics all the time. And I've kind of contextualized it to address the group that we're dealing with, Black Atheism. All right, so let's go ahead and move to the C. All right, the Kalam cosmological argument. We're going to get into that a little bit. Okay, this is what's called the Kalam cosmological argument. All right, we're going to explain. I'm going to kind of break that down here in just a second. All right. Okay, so embedded in Yakko's question about how is he come into the world, where does he come from, is this underlying notion that things which come into existence have causes. Now, from the outset, Yakko lays out reasons that he could not have been his own cause, right? For instance, he could not have created himself, since it would have been logically impossible for him to exist before he existed in order to bring about his own existence. Obviously that doesn't make logical sense, which is something that Yakko takes note of. Now, acknowledging that he is not the kind of being that can account for his own origins, Yakko then widens the scope of his search for a cause. He looks to his parents, and then his parents' parents, then his ancestry, going back to the first humans, and then finally, beyond his ancestry, to whatever it was in this material world that those first humans came from. And with each of these causes Yakko considered, he encountered the same problem. For every cause, the question could be asked, where did that come from, right? And one would always have to appeal to yet another cause. If so, then you would be left with an infinite number of causes that each are with each dependent upon one another for their existence while never getting to the bottom of why everything exists, right? So to solve this problem, Yakko concluded that there must be another type of entity that is fundamentally different from these kinds of causes. There must be an uncaused cause. Okay, that's how the conclusion that he comes to, right? So in essence, Yakko presents what's called a cosmological argument. Now, there's been many different versions going back to Plato and Aristotle that contended that the reality of cause and effect in the world points to the existence of a first cause. Now, Zara Yakko, like Thomas Aquinas, who forwarded this argument in the 13th century, Yakko inferred that this first cause must be God, all right? Now, among the various different variations of the first cause argument defended by philosophers today, this one I have on the screen, the Kalam cosmological argument, was originally formulated by medieval philosopher Al-Ghazali, and in modern times has been revitalized by Dr. William Lane Craig. This one is probably the most popular that you see today. Okay, so we're briefly going to touch on the Kalam cosmological argument, or the KCA, to shed light on how causes point to God's existence, as Yakko suggests. All right, so again, the Kalam cosmological argument can be summarized in these three steps. This is that deductive argument that we took a peek at a second ago. Okay, everything that exists, everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's premise one. Premise two, the universe began to exist. And then that leads us to a conclusion is three, therefore the universe has a cause. Pretty simple. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Okay. Now, how are we going to defend each of these premises such that we can see how that they're more plausible or more likely true than not? Okay, well, let's work our way through. First of all, let's get to premise one here. Okay. All right. Okay, so premise one, here's some defenses, right? First of all, the first premise lines up with our most foundational understanding of how the world works and how we navigate the human experience. So for example, like there's nobody sitting here watching this live right now that's concerned that our time here is going to be interrupted by some giant horse-sized lizard or something like that, appearing out of thin air in their room or in their living room or wherever you are, right? We know that things don't just kind of pop in the air and pop into being out of thin air. Why? Because you can't get something out of nothing, right? So this premise is rooted in just that metaphysical principle that something cannot come into being from nothing. It's just a basic foundational notion that holds true, not just in terms of our human experience, but it's what some philosophers would say is a fundamental truth of metaphysics. Okay, just the way that things really are, right? Now, secondly, when you think about it, the word nothing is a short way of saying no thing or not anything. So in a state of nothingness, there would be no thing with the properties, powers, capability, if you will, or potentiality to bring about an effect. So that's just by definition, you can't expect nothing to cause anything. That just makes sense, right? Excuse me. Thirdly, if things could just pop into existence out of nothing, then scientific discovery would just be impossible, since the order and consistency in nature that scientists rely upon to perform experience and make observations would just be done away with. You would just have, nature would just be a mixed bag of things just, popping in and out of existence. And there's no possible way that you can do the consistent type of experiments that scientists would need to learn anything about the world as it is, right? But nevertheless, let's just say that that's the case. I mean, if for some reason, if it were possible for something to come from nothing, then the question can be asked, like, how is it that everything doesn't just pop into being out of nothing? As Dr. William Lane Craig puts it up, I'll quote this. He says, quote, think about it. Why don't bicycles and Beethoven and root beer just pop into being out of nothing? Why is it only universes that can come into being from nothing? What makes nothingness so discriminatory? There can't be anything about nothingness that favors universes, for nothingness can't have any properties, nor can anything constrain nothingness, for there isn't anything to be constrained, end quote, right? So, it would just be absurd. I mean, like if nothingness can produce all kind of stuff, then we should be seeing just any and everything just popping into existence at any given time, which is obviously absurd. It's obviously absurd. So, in the face of such absurdities, surely it's rational to affirm our first premise is more plausibly true than not. As a matter of fact, I would add that, surely it would be a gross display of hypocrisy for atheists to deride Christians for supposedly lacking reasons to believe in God while maintaining that the universe came into being for no reason, right? So premise one, seems to be on pretty solid ground. Now, I will say this: some would push back and say, well, if everything that exists has a cause, then what caused God, right? That's a common counterpoint that people try to make. And, I just, to put it simply, that just means that they've misread the argument, because the argument isn't that everything has a cause. It says in premise one, we're saying that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The key words there is begins to exist, right? Now, God is eternal. God never began to exist, and therefore doesn't fit into the category of things that would require a cause, because he never came into being, right? So the same cannot be said for the universe, as we'll see here in a minute as we go on to premise two, and then we'll get to our conclusion in just a second. Okay, so how are we going to defend premise two? Okay, very simple, very simple. Well, somewhat simple. We'll see. We'll have a question and answer, so maybe we'll get a chance to tease it out some more. But the second premise of our argument, I will say, is the more controversial of the two. Nevertheless, there are solid philosophical and scientific reasons for affirming it. All right, and we'll get into that. Now, our first defense of premise two is one out of a series of philosophical arguments that Al-Ghazali developed to demonstrate that the universe had a beginning. So there's some philosophical arguments we're going to get to, and then we'll get to the scientific side. Now, the centerpiece of his argument is that the series of past events has been formed by adding one event after another. However, no series which is formed in such a way can actually be infinite, because you cannot pass through an infinite number of things one at a time, right? So just think about it, right? Imagine trying to count to infinity, right? You're trying to count to infinity. Now, no matter how long you count, you'll always have an infinite number of numbers to go, right? No matter how long you go, there will always be an infinity to go, right? So it's impossible to count to infinity. But here's the thing. If you can't count to infinity, then how could you count down from infinity, right? If you can't count to infinity, how could you count down from infinity? All right. Now, with that in mind, if the past is an infinite series of past events, then it would be impossible for us to have arrived at the present, right? Because there's no way that we could count down from those past infinite numbers of events down to today, right? So just consider this analogy to kind of help it make sense, all right? Let's say that you are on the 50-yard line of a football field, and I say to you, I'm going to offer you $1 million just for walking forward in a straight line to the end zone that you're facing, okay? Now, catch this for a second. The catch is, for every step forward, you must first take a step backward. And you can't turn around or veer from walking straight forward. You got to go straight in line. But for each step forward, you have to first take a step back. Okay. Now, as you moonwalk further and further away from the end zone, you would soon realize that your efforts are futile. You're not going to get that $1 million. Why? Because without a fixed starting point to move forward from, you're never going to reach the end zone and get the $1 million, right? So likewise, if there's an infinite series of past events leading up to today would never come, because you'd have to keep going further and further back with no fixed starting point of time from which to move forward to the present. Okay. In other words, to arrive at today, it would be kind of like jumping. Let's say, put it this way: if you're trying to arrive at today from a beginningless past, it would be like trying to jump out of a bottomless pit. So you don't have anything to jump from to get to today, right? So the universe can't be infinitely old then. Because the series of past events had to have a beginning at some point, or else we would not have come to today. All right, so that's a philosophical point. Kind of hold on to that for a second. To make a scientific point, right? Let's talk about the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, and that's going to sound technical, but we'll just kind of read through it and we'll get there. All right. The second law of thermodynamics states that the entropy of any isolated system always increases. Now, what the heck does that mean? Okay, so it's kind of like this. Energy flows. It's kind of like water. Say if you put water in something, like water always flows to the lowest point. Well, energy is kind of like that. It's always going to flow, if you will, or transition towards being unusable. That's what we're talking about when we mean entropy. Energy is going to always transition towards being unusable. All right. Now, here's why that's important for us today. Let's say that, to use another analogy, let's say that you're sitting there with a friend of yours, and your friend says that they left their car keys in the car, and they left the car running. Okay, they ask you to go, get their keys. Now, if you get out to the car, and if the car has stopped running, and unless somebody's tampered with it, if the car stopped running, then it would be rational for you to say, okay, well, the car must have run out of gas. It must have been running for so long that it's now out of gas, right? All things being equal. Now, if you get out there and the car is still running, you get the keys and so forth, it was still running when you got there, then that means that the car had not been running for so long that it had run out of gas, okay? Now, here's the thing. With the universe, it's kind of like that car. Our universe has all this usable energy, and given the fact that this usable energy is still here today, then that means that our universe hasn't run out of gas, right? It still has usable energy. But if the universe was infinitely old, then we should already be at the point where the universe has run out of gas and there's no usable energy in our universe. But obviously that's not the case, because I'm sitting here talking to you right now. I'm moving my hands, and we got energy all around us, obviously. So the fact that this universe hasn't run out of gas yet tells us that it must not be infinitely old, right? Okay, so we'll come back to that in a second, maybe. I'm not going to get into the Big Bang model, but right now what's called the standard model of cosmology, aka popularly known as the Big Bang, is it entails that there must have been a beginning. As a matter of fact, several scientific studies have confirmed that. Going from Einstein to the discovery of redshift to what's called the BGB theorem and so forth. There's been all these scientific discoveries to affirm the standard model of cosmology, aka the Big Bang theory, which indicates that the universe in some sense had a beginning. So we'll table that for now, but suffice it to say that for philosophical reasons and for the scientific reasons that I've alluded to, there's good reason to affirm premise 2 of our argument here, which then leads us back to the conclusion. The universe had a cause. Now we have to ask ourselves a question then. Again, if everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, and now our conclusion, the universe has a cause. What must that cause be like? That's where we're going to do some secondary analysis, okay? Now, first of all, when scientists use the term universe, okay, they're using the term universe to refer to everything, including time, space, matter, and energy. All time, space, matter, and energy. That's what they mean by universe, okay? All right, now if that's the case, then obviously, first of all, whatever the cause of the universe is, it would have to be something that's distinct from or apart from the universe, obviously. And it would need to be something that's timeless and exceedingly powerful, as Yakko surmised, as well as spaceless and immaterial. Now, already that's starting to sound really familiar. We've got a timeless, exceedingly powerful, spaceless, immaterial cause of the universe. All right. Now, isn't it interesting? With respect to things that are timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, as Dr. William Lane Craig notes, there are only two sorts of things that can fit that description. Either an abstract object, like a number, or some sort of like moral value or something like that. But just use numbers as an example. All right. So an abstract object like a number, or an unembodied mind, right? But abstract objects can't cause anything, right? This is part of the definition of what it means to be abstract. So for example, the number 7 can't cause me to, to stumble or something like that. You can't, hurt somebody with the number 7. I'm saying the number 7 is an abstract object. It can't cause anything. Okay. So the cause of the existence of the universe must be a transcendent mind, which is what believers understand God to be, right? Now, also a personal cause would also make sense of how there could be a timeless cause that produces a finite effect, okay? If you got this, it would be like, let's say if you got some eternally existing gasoline and matches, I'm saying, like, they exist eternally. Well, what causes those causes to bring about an explosion? Somebody has to put them together, right? So in the same way, if you have a cause that's eternal, but the effect comes into being at a certain point, what could account for that? Well, if it's a personal cause, then that cause can decide to bring that effect into being at some point in the finite past. All right. So anyway, with that being said, it's plausible that this cause would have to be personal, as in having a mind with the capacity to reason, have intentions, act upon what it wills to do, and so forth. And so an analysis of the qualities and explanation of the universe would, in terms of what do we need to have, points us to a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, unimaginably powerful, and personal cause. That's what Christians refer to as God. So again, that brings us back to our conclusion. Therefore, God exists. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And the best explanation of what that cause would be God. All right. So I'm going to pause there. I know we want to do some Q&A. We covered a lot so far. So I'm going to, I guess, bring JC in, or do we want to tackle some questions or before we move on to the next argument?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Hey, excellent so far, brother. And appreciate you just even laying out that framework of some of the Black atheists, leading Black atheists today, and some of the reasons that are leading African Americans to turn to atheism. I think that's helpful. In line with that, one of the questions, and please go ahead and type your questions in the chat, either Facebook Live or if you're on Zoom with us, go ahead and type your questions in the chat. And we're just pausing for about 10 to 15 minutes here to take questions so far, just to clarify things that Adam has been saying or just on the topic. And then he's going to do the second half of his presentation. But go ahead and put your questions in the chat and we'll address those questions. So Adam, one of the questions earlier, there was a sister, Jessie, she brought up when you mentioned Baldwin and Hughes. And so I'm not sure what book she's read. I did mention to her The Fire Next Time, where Baldwin talks about his transition into atheism. Mm-hmm. Now, she mentioned the Western, she was saying from her understanding, Baldwin and Hughes are critiquing the Western church's representation of God, but it seems like she's not understanding or seeing that they became full out atheists. So maybe in her mind, they're critiquing this Western notion of God, but didn't move away from a belief in God altogether. Do you have any books on them that you would point to, or quotes or anything like that, or just any response to that you would point to as far as just their atheism?
Sure. Yeah, well, one thing I want to say at the outset is that when it comes to philosophy, precision of language is very important. It's kind of like just a linchpin of what philosophy is all about. And so the way that I worded, if you run the tape back, is that these individuals gave voice to humanism and atheism. Because I've got a number of individuals like Claude McKay that I mentioned, Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston, will probably be more overt in terms of her expressing atheism. But, I want to be clear that it's the Black atheist community that would argue that these individuals gave voice to what they refer to as humanism and atheism. Now, humanism, I guess it's kind of like atheism diet or atheism light, if you will, where I think it's considered to be less abrasive. You're just, all about, humankind, so to speak. And they would say that somebody like Langston Hughes articulated views along those lines. Now, with that being said, I think one thing that's confusing about James Baldwin is that people say, well, he never out and out, claimed to be an atheist. But actually, like you mentioned, with The Fire Next Time, like they'll talk about there's this famous quote where he says that if God can't basically make us more good and more loving and so forth, then it's time that we've gotten rid of him. And so people normally just quote that one line. But if you look at the whole chapter, what he's done is, before he's made that statement, he's laid out a series of critiques to illustrate that God can't do these things. Right. So he's saying throughout the chapter, that God can account for, what he's seeing in terms of his moral experience and shady preachers and just, illegitimate experience that he's had. So he lays all that out. And then on the back end of that, he says, if God can't do these things, then it's time we've gotten rid of him. So it's an if-then statement. It's a conditional. So really, the argument he's made, you can infer that what he's trying to communicate is God can't do these things. Therefore, it's time that we got rid of him. And so that's why I think we can make a stronger claim than that he's just, flirted with atheism or something like that. I think that you can say that he's actually making the argument that God doesn't exist. Mm. And again, that's from the Fire Next Time. Mm. Yeah.
Oh, that's helpful, brother. Thank you. And just a follow, and please type your questions in the chat. I know there's a little lag between the Zoom and the Facebook Live. Go ahead and type your questions in the chat so brother Adam can address them. So Adam, real quick, just following up with that, what you mentioned with brother Baldwin. And so Baldwin grew up in the Pentecostal Black church in New York, and he saw a lot of hypocrisy and things like that. He was a youth preacher himself. And so he ends up, because of hypocrisy, turning away from God. And you laid out some of the framework earlier, the reasons or issues you see African Americans turning away from belief in God. So with that said, if you're addressing an African American person who, because of history of oppression or slavery or hypocrisy, whatever it may be, that's caused them to turn away from faith in God, would you go right into these philosophical, intellectual type of arguments and things, or are there other things you would do first to begin to prep them for these type of intellectual arguments? Are there some things you would address first with them?
Yeah, it depends on the situation. I mean, one thing that I've actually, as I've been doing apologetics, I've had to correct myself on is sometimes we assume that the core issue that the person's having is intellectual just because they're presenting an intellectual objection, right? But a lot of times what you find out is that it's really just a smokescreen for something that's experiential or emotionally based. And so, one thing we'll get into in the end here is the importance of listening and making sure that, rather than just kind of just jumping into giving arguments and rebutting this, rebutting that. The first thing we want to do is listen to people, because sometimes they'll actually talk their way into telling you exactly what's really going on with them, and you can spend 35 minutes going through the Kalam cosmological argument when really their problem is something that happened. Maybe they were molested or something like that,
Yeah.
or maybe they was at church and the church ladies with the with the fishnet hats and all that kind of stuff, and the napkin on the lap, was looking at them sideways because they didn't have that, and they walked in looking any kind of way. It could be a number of various different things, but we have to put it this way. In any given conversation, you're not trying to respond to the question or to the objection. You want to respond to the person, okay? Mm-hmm. And the only way that you can do that is opening up lines of communication and creating a listening and reflective atmosphere in that conversation where you can really get where that person's coming from. And if it just so happens that they're really harping on that intellectual issue, okay, then fine, you can go there. But a lot of times I think you can save yourself some time and getting behind that intellectual question, and really dealing with what's going on with that person. Yeah.
Man, that's really good. And for you all, we're trying to again marry apologetics to evangelism. And so what he just said, I think, is very helpful in listening to people and really getting to the heart of their objections. And Brother Adam is giving us these intellectual and philosophical arguments, plausible arguments and evidence for the existence of God. And at the same time, he's also letting us know that we want to ask questions and see where they are, because there may be some other issues that we also have to address. Like he said, things that they may have gone through in the past and things like that. So I think that's excellent, brother. Let's go through some of these questions here. The questions are coming in heavy. So let's try to get as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. So we got Sister Layla said, you added personal to the framework. I believe that last framework you were pointing to. And so why is it necessary that the entity be personal? She says some argue that God or the idea of him need not be. And so, yeah, why is it necessary that the entity that you're describing be personal? What would you say to that?
Sure. Yeah, I gave two arguments there for the personality, if you will, of the first cause. So one would be this notion that ultimately, if you have a cause that has to be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, as I quoted from Dr. William Lane Craig, there's really only two kinds of entities that can meet that description. It would either be some sort of abstract object, or it would be something like an unembodied mind. And so given the fact that abstract objects, by definition, they don't have causal powers, and that's why I was talking about the number 7 or something like that. Numbers, they don't cause anything, right? And so, and neither do any other abstract objects, right? So therefore, the only other option would be that there's this unembodied mind. So that was one argument that I gave. Mm-hmm. The other argument, I just kind of breezed through it just for the sake of time. But if you have an infinite cause, a cause that is infinite in the past, and a finite effect, something that started, just at some point, then the question is, well, why didn't the effect happen infinitely long ago? How do you have this infinite cause that doesn't have an effect that goes back infinitely parallel with it? And the best explanation for that would be is that infinite cause has the ability to decide to go from a position of inaction to action, as in creating, bringing creation into effect. Now, to have that sort of intention or ability to decide, ability to will, those things are features of minds. Those things are features of persons, okay? And so therefore, it wouldn't make sense for an impersonal force or something like that to bring a finite effect into being, because if it was an impersonal cause, then we would expect the effect to be eternally real as well, or to have existed eternally. And that's not what we see with the universe. We have good reason to think that the universe isn't eternal, that effect, right? The other thing is, too, going back to Zara, Yakko, and we're not going to go here now because it gets into the R of my score here, which I think is on the screen. I don't know if they can see it right now, but the issue of reason, a entity that has a mind, it has, a consciousness, is a better explanation for why conscious beings can come into existence versus you having something that's unconscious bringing about consciousness. So in the philosophical literature, there's all sorts of arguments that can be made there. As a matter of fact, I got a book right here that I can just kind of refer to, and then we can move on to the next question. But there's this book here by J.P. Moreland called The Soul. It's by J.P. Moreland called The Soul, and he gets into what's called substance dualism, which can, gets into why I think a eternal transcendent mind is best accounts for why we conscious beings exist.
Yeah, I think that's a compelling argument, brother, for pointing to a personal entity. And we on that you just mentioned one of the books by J.P. Moreland. We have somebody asking, what are some other books that you would suggest for beginners wanting to get into this topic? Some beginner level type books, primers.
Bam, right here. On Guard by William Lane Craig. I've mentioned him a couple times thus far, but this one I would definitely recommend because it really gives you diagrams and just it's very accessible. So anybody who wants to start out, and it breaks down this Kalam cosmological argument in more detail than I just did. And so I would highly recommend that one. Also, you can do I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist by Frank Turek. Stealing from God by Frank Turek, and I'm trying to think. There's another one I just had in my mind. Maybe it'll come back to me. But for those who want to dig deeper into like the argument from reason, I would recommend a book by Victor Reppert called C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea. So that'd be another good one to dig into.
Okay, good. Let's take a couple more questions and then we'll get back to the presentation. We got some people hopping in, so we're in Q&A right now, halfway through the presentation. Then we're going to get back into the presentation itself. I just want to clarify some things for people that have been tuning in. Go ahead, if you're appreciating just the content that our brother is putting out, please smash the like button and share this on your page so that others can get in on this. And this is just a great video that you can even use with atheists and skeptics and let them watch it. And then you two have a discussion with it. We want to bring this apologetics material into our evangelism. And so great material. Also want to take a quick second to plug my brother Adam and just the other outlets that he has. If you want to follow him even more, you can check him out on his YouTube page, Tru-ID Apologetics. That's Tru-ID, the letters ID, Apologetics. That's his YouTube page. You can like and subscribe there. And he has a lot more content. The brother is sharp and brilliant. And as you can tell, just he has studied this, and yet he brings it down to a very understandable and accessible just way to understand this for everyday believers. And so go ahead and follow him there. And then also, if you want more information about the Surge Evangelism Ministry and some of the evangelism and apologetic stuff we're doing now and going forward, and justice initiatives and outreaches, then hit me up, jcjones at epiphanyfellowship.org. Let's take a couple more questions, then we'll get back to the presentation. So we have a question from Sister Lou Johnson here, brother. She says, many Black people are also saying that they're quote unquote spiritual. And so I'm sure you probably heard that, people saying they're spiritual but not religious. And she says, perhaps you cover this under the unaffiliated category, but I wonder, how have you engaged the spiritual person from a redemptive and God-centered focus? I hear people engaging from more of a moral standpoint, but I'm concerned that it leads to a moralistic Christianity. What would you say to that, brother?
Oh, it's a very perceptive question. Very good. So actually in this acronym here, you notice like at the end, I've got evidence for Jesus' resurrection. That's where I'm always trying to go. I'm saying we can make that's another book that I would recommend that people get Mike Licona's The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Actually, it's Mike Licona and Gary Habermas. There's a history-based argument that we can make for the resurrection of Jesus that takes us beyond just identifying that some God exists, but really narrows us in on who that God actually is. And so for somebody who just says that they're into spirituality and so forth, that's where I like to go. I'd like to bring them to that historical argument for Jesus' resurrection, because if Jesus rose from the dead by the power of God, that tells us a whole lot about which God is the true God. You see what I'm saying? But then on top of that, sometimes it can be helpful, because she mentioned the moral piece. Sometimes it can be helpful to explore some of the inconsistencies and the moral frameworks of people who are just kind of claiming to be spiritual. A lot of times they tend to be moral relativists or moral subjectivists, and actually we'll get into that in a second, as a matter of fact. But sometimes their moral framework will have some inconsistencies that you can use to point people towards the biblical moral framework, and then from there, jump into sin what sin is, and then from there jump into the cross and the resurrection. So I always I'm always angling towards the resurrection, because you get the gospel in there, and then you also direct people towards Jesus. I mean, the one and true living God.
Yeah, that brother, that is powerful. That's excellent. And Lou, that was a great question. And I love your response, brother, because we can talk about the intellectual, the rational, the moral, and things like that. And then I love how you're tying it all in and bringing it back to Christ and the gospel. So it's both in, and we can bring it all together. So that's excellent, brother. So we'll get ready to get back into the presentation itself. We're going to have another Q&A at the end of the presentation. And so if you got questions, go ahead and save those for the end. We'll take more questions at the end. Real quick, this comment from Sister Jasmine, I think it's just excellent. I want to highlight it. She says that she has Geisler's and Turek's book and the corresponding workbook, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which you just mentioned. Yeah. She's planning to use that with her youth group at her church. And then she wants to, especially for recent graduates, and just trying to prepare them as they step into the university and collegiate level. And I just want to highlight, Sister Jasmine, that is excellent. And that's what our churches need to be doing. That is why we're doing this apologetics training, because this issue of atheism, especially in the Black community and also in the white community, it's not going anywhere. And if we do a disservice with this anti-intellectual Christianity that thinks that all you got to do is just pray your way through and don't question God and all of that stuff, we got to do away with the anti-intellectualism. We are losing millennials and Gen Z. They're going off to college and or other levels of academia, and they are unequipped, and their faith gets knocked. That little bit of shallow faith, it gets knocked out of them. That's why we're doing what we're doing. So I wanted to.
Can I comment on that real quick? Because that's very important, man. I want to give her a shout out, for that, because being proactive in that regard, and just to kind of use an analogy. And this is a football analogy, but back in the day, I'm an '80s baby, so I go back to at least to the '80s. But in football, if you had a concussion, then people would just say, "Oh, you got your bell rung," throw some smelling salt at you, smelling salt at you, and then you'd be back in maybe like the next play or something like that, because people didn't know as much about concussions as they do now. But now we know more about concussions. We know that you can't just get back in the game. You know what I'm saying? Like, you got to get some treatment. You got to really take it seriously. And I think that it's the same way with atheism in the Black community. Back in the day, if you had questions and doubts and so forth, they would say, "Oh, no, you'd be all right. Just pray about it," or just go to church Sunday and have somebody pray for you, you'd be all right. And somebody's got this moral, spiritual concussion that they're taking lightly, and we can't afford to do that now. You know what I'm saying? We can't afford to do that now, and shouldn't have been doing it then. Saying now that we know more and we know what the deal is, we need to be taking these things seriously. And so what do? In the football world, they created better padding, better helmets, and so forth. We need to be equipping the saints, particularly our young believers going into the college setting. We need to be equipping these young believers with the proper protective gear so that they don't end up with these moral and spiritual concussions in their young adult lives.
Brother, bars. Bars, man. I got nothing further to add to that, man.
Okay, cool.
And our sister Storm, she said we can have an informed and an inflamed faith. I like how another person puts it, that learning and the burning. So listen, it's both, and you can have reason and intellect, and you can also have the passion and that fire for God. And that's what we sense with you, Brother Adam. So thank you. Without further ado, go ahead and get back into your presentation. Everybody, we're going to get back into questions at the end of his presentation. Adam is going to go for about another 30 minutes presenting here, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. Again, please check out our brother Tru-ID podcast, and then also his Tru-ID Apologetics page on YouTube. Like and subscribe. And then with this video, go ahead and smash that like button and share this. And so we can get more people getting this content out, especially coming from an African-American man. People need to see African-American men and women engaging in urban apologetics. This is vital and important. And so please go ahead and spread this. All right, Brother Adam, you can go ahead and get back into your presentation. We'll have Q&A at the end.
Great, man. So I appreciate the questions, man. I'm sure we'll generate some more here with the content that we'll get into, but I'm loving the vibe, man. So if you guys remember at the beginning, I talked about those two streams of critique that we tend to get from Black atheists. One would be that, believing in God and Christianity is irrational. And so I just showed you an argument that, we're obviously not appealing to emotion. We're not appealing to tradition. It's just good old fashioned reasoning and critical thinking. And we've come to the conclusion that this God, this immaterial, spaceless, timeless, unimaginably powerful, personal being exists, right? But now I want to deal with that second stream of critique where I talked about how there's like the problem of evil that people tend to throw at us, or these different moral critiques of the church and so on and so forth. I want to get into that a little bit as we deal with the O in our SCORE acronym here. Particularly, we're going to deal with the moral side or moral order, if you will. Okay, so that's what we're going to be getting into. Now, as I do that, let me bring up my next slide here. All right, bear with me. Okay. So as I do that, I want to introduce two gentlemen to you, one of which I think will probably be familiar. Okay. Now, first we have this man here. His name is Josiah Wedgwood. Okay. Now, Josiah Wedgwood was a very successful potter in the 18th century who became involved later in life in the abolitionist movement. Okay. At the request of a group of abolitionist ministers, Wedgwood designed this piece here that you see on the right with the praying enslaved person. And the caption says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Now, they would print this symbol rather on pottery, clothing accessories, even coins, as a matter of fact. And this sign like literally became kind of like the McDonald's sign or the bat symbol of the abolitionist movement there in the 18th century. Okay. Sometimes this image would be accompanied by a scripture as well. But this phrase, "Am I not a man and a brother?" itself really draws upon the biblical reality that we are all made in God's image. And thus there should be an acknowledgement of shared personhood between Africans and Europeans. That's what this symbol here was intended to indicate. All right, so just hold on to that for 1 second. That's Josiah Wedgwood. Okay. Now, Charles Darwin. He's the father of modern evolutionary theory. Okay. Now he comes along and he says this here. I'm just going to read the quote and I'll let y'all, we're going to chew on a little bit. Okay. He says this in his work called The Descent of Man. He says, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world." End quote. I want to say that, I think he printed that in 1871, I believe. Okay. So contrary to Josiah Wedgwood and company asserting that there's this higher view and better treatment of Africans that should be expected, Darwin would have considered somebody like myself to be among those so-called savage races who were to be exterminated and replaced. Now, there's an interesting connection between these two men. As it turns out, Josiah Wedgwood is Charles Darwin's grandfather. Josiah Wedgwood is Charles Darwin's grandfather. Now, just think about what a difference a worldview makes, right? Same family tree, but two different worldviews. And as a result, two radically different views on the personhood and humanity of African enslaved persons. Okay. Now, I actually have a whole presentation that I do called "The Image of God and the Black Experience," because all throughout the abolitionist movement and fight for civil rights, this concept of being made in God's image is a fixture in the argumentation and efforts of those who fought for the freedom of African people in the West. But I just want that to really sink in. Worldviews matter. Okay. Worldviews matter because depending on what your worldview is, you see how very different, excuse me, the outworking can be when it comes to moral issues. In this case, talking about slavery, chattel slavery. All right. Now, I want to give a quick example of what I'm talking about in terms of abolitionists using the image of God explicitly in their argumentation against slavery. Okay. All right. This is from my man Leonard Black. Leonard Black, right? He was a minister and an abolitionist. He had escaped from slavery himself. And in his autobiography, he makes a statement right here. He says, "Is man to be considered a mere ox to be bowed up and stall fed?" I mean, according to Darwin, apparently so. But anyway, is man to be considered a mere ox to be bowed up and stall fed? Has he not a mind capable of rising higher and higher in all that is expansive, pure, and holy? Has he not within him a spark of pure divinity, which when he is surrounded by high and ennobling influences is fanned into a light so bright as to lead us to respond to the glorious truth that man is indeed made in the image of God? Do you talk of selling a man? You might as well talk of selling immortality or sunshine. That's bars right there. You might as well talk of selling immortality, or sunshine. See, right there, Leonard Black is able to appeal to the biblical worldview for a creator who has intentions for how humans are to be treated and is a transcendent source for the value of the enslaved person, right? But see, atheism can't give you that. More specifically, if you take God out of the picture and attempt to understand mankind through a naturalistic lens, as Darwin tried to do, then I'd argue that you remove any objective basis for human value. As a matter of fact, here's what we're going to do. We're going to bring up another deductive argument, and we're going to kind of distill that down into 3 easy steps. Okay. All right. There we go. And no, I'm not advocating for people to be, using the all lives matter slogan as a to beat down other people who are talking about racism. Just want to throw that out there. I'm just posing the question for sake of the argument here. Okay, if God does not exist, then objective human value does not exist. Human beings possess objective value. Therefore, God exists, right? So actually, you could be, if I wanted to be funny, I could say if all lives matter, then God exists, if I want to put it simply, but we'll stick with our syllogism here, our deductive argument here. If God does not exist, then objective human value does not exist. Human beings possess objective value, therefore God exists, okay? Now, the most important word here is going to be that word of objective, okay? Let me move to the next slide here. And we covered this a little bit last time, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it today, but people can go back to the last time I was here and maybe get a little bit more depth. But yeah, the key word here is objective, right? Humans are objectively valuable in the moral sense, okay? Now, generally speaking, when philosophers are dealing with morality, they divide it into 2 categories. We're talking about subjective morality or objective morality, okay? Now, subjective morality would be to say that things are either good, bad, right, or wrong, depending on what a person or a group of people think about it or the stance that they have toward it. So last time, like I used the example, it would be like if I said that vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate ice cream, okay? Obviously, that's just my subjective opinion. That's subjective, right? I can argue with you all day and you can say, no, chocolate is better, but neither one of us is really right or wrong. We're just conveying our stance or our opinion on what ice cream is best. And so if morality is subjective, it's the same thing, just people basically saying from their own vantage point, from their opinion, what they think is morally right, wrong, good, or bad. It's just subjective, okay? Now, objective morality is if something is good, bad, right, or wrong as a fact of the matter, regardless of what any person or group of people think about it or what their stance is, it's just like 2 + 2 = 4, no matter what anybody thinks about it, murder is wrong. Or, injustice is evil. Okay, so morality is what it is, independent of what people or persons think about it or their stances on it. Okay, so that's going to be crucial here as we talk about objective human value. Okay, now real quick, when we talk about values, there's a lot of different directions we can go there. But I think I mentioned it earlier that we're talking about value in the moral sense. You're having some sort of objective basis for human dignity, if you will. We could use that word as well. Okay, so is it the case that humans have this objective dignity? All right, now how do we go about defending premise 1? Because I'm contending that if God does not exist, then objective human value does not exist. Okay, so how are we going to defend that first premise there and work our way towards this conclusion? Well, consider the first premise. In the biblical worldview, we have a being, God, who is morally perfect. The Bible says he is light. God is love. It's not that he just has those things. God is love. He is light, which represents righteousness in that passage, right? So God is morally perfect, and he's actually the very essence of what it means to be good, what it means to be good. God is that, okay? He created everything, including mankind, and called us good, right? We were made valuable. God endowed us with that, okay? But if that's not the case, if God doesn't exist, then it isn't so. Now, actually, to kind of just put another quote in here, one of the premier authors and thought leaders in the Black community today is atheist Ta-Nehisi Coates. And in his critically acclaimed work, Between the World and Me, Coates shares his naturalistic view of humanity when he says this. He says, quote, "I have no God to hold me up. And I believe that when they shatter the body, they shatter everything. There's nothing to me more than the body," right? He says, when they shatter the body, they shatter everything. And I knew that all of us, Christians, Muslims, atheists, lived in fear of this truth, end quote. Now, I don't live in fear of that truth because I know that I'm made in the image of God. But this is what Ta-Nehisi Coates is claiming. He says he has no God to hold him up. And when they shatter the body, they shatter everything, right? Now, if naturalism is true, if atheism is true, then I suppose Ta-Nehisi Coates is right. at some point in the past, the universe came into being from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. And so nothing is essentially the mother of everything, if atheism is true. But here's the thing. Nothingness doesn't have intentions, and therefore can't be the source of something like value in the moral sense. If for some logic defying reason the universe has always existed, or, it's really unclear as to how objective value of any sort comes into the picture, including human value. And if the universe came out of nothing, again, you still don't have anything to attribute human value to, right? So it seems to be that on naturalism, we live in a valueless world, right? As far as objective values are concerned. Now, if we can't look to the origins of the natural world to find any objective foundation for personal value, is there anything about nature itself that can account for it? And I think the answer is clearly no. And I say that for at least a couple of reasons that we'll just kind of breeze through. First of all, broadly speaking, it's within the purview of the sciences to describe the natural world as it is, and attempt to make predictions on how things will be. Okay, we can conduct experiments on all sorts of things and make observations about how much something weighs, what it tastes like, how dense it is, how hot or cold it tends to be, how it interacts with other forms of matter, and so on, right? But moral worth isn't a test tubable sort of thing, is it? It's not a test tubable sort of thing, right? It wouldn't make sense for us to put you, me, a dog, and a bottle of water in a lab and then ask a team of scientists to give us a readout on the amount of moral worth we each contain. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? I mean, just when you think about it, what instruments would a scientist use to ascertain how many units of moral value I have in my left hand right here, or something like that? It's obviously nonsense. And I mean, I'm sure that question seems kind of silly, but I think it illustrates the fundamental point that moral worth is not a natural feature of matter. Okay, moral worth is not a natural feature of matter. Again, like I said, through the sciences, we have access to all kinds of natural facts, like I just alluded to, that are essentially descriptive of the world as it is. We can describe the world as it is. However, moral facts, like the notion that humans have objective value, are fundamentally different and from natural facts in that they are prescriptive. They impose upon us notions about how things ought to be. So descriptive, we can, like think how much things weigh, what it smells like. Those things are descriptive. They tell us how things are. But moral facts tell us how things ought to be. That's fundamentally different. Okay. Now, as I'm quote another atheist, as atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie argued, given that the objective moral values, given that objective moral values would be, quote, qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe, end quote. On an atheistic worldview, one would be rational to take this as evidence that such values do not exist. That's the argument that J.L. Mackie makes. And again, he's an atheist, right? So it's not just Christians saying this stuff, Anyway, so some suggest that, the theory of evolution can maybe save the day, if you will, through natural selection and random mutation. Maybe somehow we evolved into conscious creatures with some sort of communal tendencies and the capacity to feel empathy towards others, right? Our communal nature and empathy gave rise to cooperative behavior, which helped humans survive, and notions of human value are outworkings of maybe our evolutionary history. Somebody might want to make that argument. But if you just kind of do an overview of human history with all our schisms, isms, and wars, that would suggest that nature has not instilled in us a species-wide conception of who we ought to include in our herd, so to speak. Rather, it seems to reflect a broader story of natural selection in which survival of the fittest is ultimately the name of the game. And in a world of limited resources where survival is the highest ethic, it would be perfectly rational to consider any notion of objective human value to be at best a useful fiction, if you will. Okay, so when the rubber meets the road, human value on naturalism or atheism has to take a back seat if and when the survival of the herd is at stake, whoever we take our herd to be. Okay, now just lastly, on this point, some atheists might want to add an extra little wrinkle in their model of morality and say that objective moral values exist in the same sense that abstract objects exist, like maybe in the same way that numbers exist, and that we have evolved with rational faculties such that we can identify them. But I guess if true, then voila, you can still have moral value and keep God out of the picture, right? But this sort of explanation for moral value seems to really miss the mark. If the universe has always existed without a cause, it just popped into being from nothing, and by chance, the forces of nature work together to form atoms, elements, molecules, and then way later on down the road, through some unguided process of evolution, created us, it would be an extraordinary coincidence that these moral values were just floating around as part of immaterial reality, and we just happened to develop in just the right way to accurately perceive them. That's just highly improbable, to say the least. And many philosophers have argued, just as I have, that there's no good reason to think that that's the case. But aside from that, even if it could be shown that valuing fellow humans is an outworking of evolution, is widely recognized among philosophers that attempt to deduce or derive human value from such observations is to commit the is-ought fallacy. The is-ought fallacy. Okay. In other words, the mere fact that something is a certain way in nature does not mean that it ought to be that way. Okay. So, for example, there are some sharks that eat their young. That is the case. Now, just because it is the case that sharks eat their young, should it be the case that we ought to eat our young? Obviously not. There's not a direct parallel between what you see in nature and the moral oughts that we all recognize. Okay. Now, each of these points could be fleshed out in greater detail, but for now, I just simply want to note that for reasons like these, one can reasonably affirm that if God does not exist, then there remains no grounds for objective human value. And with that said, I'll quickly move on to defending premise 2. Actually, I think we're making pretty good time. So I'll move on to premise 2, and that'll give us our second argument. Okay. Now, with premise 2, we have good reason to affirm it. Excuse me. Yeah, let me move on to that. I already have it up there. Okay, cool. So in premise 2, we have good reason to affirm it because it aligns with our deepest intuitions about morality. And by intuitions, I do not mean just like merely how we feel about morality. Okay. Now, philosophers use the term intuition, moral intuitions, to refer to a deeply ingrained awareness or knowledge. And when it comes to morality, any moral framework has to provide a rational account of why our moral intuitions are the way they are in order to be regarded as a solid explanation of morality. So that's what I mean when I say intuition. It's not just a feeling, but it's like this deeply ingrained awareness or knowledge. Now, just think about this scenario real quick, if you will. Okay. Let's suppose that you were on a cruise ship and the captain comes over the loudspeaker and says, look, I got good news and I got bad news. The bad news is our cruise ship is sinking and we won't make it to the destination unless we get rid of some weight that we're carrying. The good news is, by my calculation, all we have to do is either throw 25 chairs overboard or 25 people overboard. And I've decided to let the passengers choose which course of action we should take. Now, I think it goes without saying that if the dude next to you starts chucking kids and moms and stuff into the ocean, you probably think something is wrong with him, right? I mean, it's obvious that there's something wrong with that. If humans have no value, or if value is merely subjective, then actually, I guess it doesn't really matter either way. But I think we know that if the dude next to you starts giving passengers the boot, then he's not been rational in that instance, right? He's made the irrational choice to throw people into the ocean rather than furniture, So why do we recognize that would obviously be silly? Is because our deepest intuitions point to it being more rational to affirm that people truly have value and should not be treated with less care than furniture. Now, lest we think that that's some sort of just hypothetical situation, let me deal with this right here. Okay. I brought up a picture here. All right. Like I said, lest we think this scenario is purely hypothetical, there's an historical parallel which demonstrates the real world consequences of getting the value question wrong. Okay. Now, on September 6, 1781, the British ship Zong set sail from West Africa to Jamaica carrying over 400 enslaved persons. Now, prior to departure, the Zong's owner, James Gregson, had a shipment of slaves insured, which was actually common practice at the time, right? Now, after a few months at sea, the crew of the Zong found themselves in a real desperate situation. They were off course and did not have enough water for the remainder of the voyage. Now, in addition, both enslaved persons and crew members were dying of disease as well. So, facing a grim dilemma, the ship's captain, Luke Collingwood, made a fateful decision. On November 29th, 1781, Captain Collingwood ordered that his crew get rid of some of the cargo. All right. So that's what they did. That's what they did. They actually threw African enslaved persons overboard in order to lighten the load to make it to their destination because they were considered to be cargo. Right. Now, after his crew gets rid of the cargo, over the course of a few days, the crew of the Zong threw about 131 Africans overboard to their deaths. That's the estimate. Now, when the Zong arrived in Jamaica, Gregson filed his insurance claim for the monetary damage he suffered for the slain Africans, and initially received pushback from the insurance company, who objected that the Zong was found to have had sufficient amount of water upon arrival in Jamaica. But nevertheless, Gregson was initially awarded his insurance money after the courts upheld his claim, and however later on that decision was later on overturned on appeal. Now, this case has come to be called the Zong Massacre. It just created a huge uproar, and really kind of became the case for abolitionists to demonstrate to the broader society, particularly over there in Europe, how heinous chattel slavery was. So individuals like Alado Equiano, for example, who'd been around at this time, leading the charge of abolitionism, would have appealed to this case to demonstrate how bad chattel slavery was and the slave trade. Now, suffice it to say, if you find yourself in agreement with me that what happened to those Africans on the Zong was dead wrong, just objectively wrong, then we're also in agreement that premise 2 is more likely true than not. Humans possess objective value, right? If you deny premise 2, then you just would have to say that all those Africans, well, you would have to agree with Luke Collingwood and those other enslavers that the Africans were nothing more than the cargo, and they were justified in throwing them overboard. But anybody with moral sense, I think, would take note that obviously something wrong was done there, right? So I'd say that, with that being the case, it's rational then to affirm that each of these premises that we have, both 1 and 2, if God does not exist and objective human value does not exist, and premise 2, human beings have objective value, we can rationally affirm then that what follows from that is a solid conclusion. Therefore, God exists, right? So when dealing with Black atheists, as we're grappling with issues like slavery, for example, I say, hey, if you think that child slavery was wrong and was an assault on human dignity, I'm like, great, I agree. I'd argue that your worldview doesn't have the moral resources to support that conviction, though. So you should join me in affirming that God exists. At the end of the day, the very existence of objective human value points to the existence of God. Now, much more can be said on that topic, but I'll leave that for now. And I just want to kind of summarize a real brief critique of, what I think kind of follows from that, the two arguments that we've given against Black atheism or atheism proper, is that A, just in general, with the denial of God's existence, atheism gives a false depiction of the way the reality is. Okay. B, in doing so, atheism fails to account for the essential aspects of human experience that one would need in order to navigate the moral complexities of our people's history and the human experience. And then C, Black atheism cannot provide a solid framework for morality and identity from which to build and move forward as a community. Okay. So, I think, atheism presents a two-pronged problem. First of all, atheism puts you in peril of being eternally lost, apart from God, eternally, cut off, given that you have not accepted Christ as your savior and so forth. But then even in the here and now, it presents other problems in the sense that if you can't account for morality, you can't build a community on a foundation of a worldview that can't account for morality. That's the most basic aspect of the human experience. You know what I'm saying? Whether it be calls for justice, whether it be, any sort of reform that we want to see come through, and from a governmental standpoint, any sort of moral cause, any sort of moral aims that our community needs to be, striving for to attain, really just to thrive. Atheism can't account for that because it can't account for morality in general. You know what I'm saying? So that's why I say all the time, you cannot build a strong community on a foundation of weak ideas. Atheism is a compilation of weak ideas because it cannot account for the very basics that we need in order to thrive. So with that being said, I just had a couple more things in regard to how to engage folks. You know what I'm saying? How do you engage atheists? I'll be quick with it because I know we want to leave time for questions and whatnot. But just real quick, listen, do's and don'ts. Number one, listen. I kind of covered that in the question earlier, but don't be so quick to jump in and give a response all the time. Make sure that you really listen. The Bible actually instructs us to be quick to listen and slow to speak. So that's actually a biblical command, and we need to apply that even when we're doing apologetics. Number two, share the burden of proof. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I talked about it last time, but one, just like, it's like nails on a chalkboard, man. I can't stand it when we as Christians, we jump into, or kind of painting ourselves in a corner, if you will, by assuming that in every conversation, we're the only ones that have to prove a case. No, if somebody believes that there is no God, or if they think that there's some better explanation of reality other than theism, other than God exists, then it's on them to defend that claim. Saying we don't have to go around disproving everything. I'm saying, and I think that's a big mistake that we tend to make. Make sure that they're bearing the burden of proof on their end of the conversation. Number three, ask a lot of questions. Ask a lot of questions. I'll come back to that in a second. But you can actually guide a whole conversation just by asking questions and really be in the driver's seat to get to where you want to get to, which is ultimately the gospel. Now, in terms of some don'ts, real quick, you don't want to rush. You may not be able to get through all the elements of the SCORE acronym that I gave, or you might not be able to give them 50 different arguments for God's existence, and that's okay. That's okay. Take your time and try to walk people through things. Being an apologist or doing apologetics is not just about answering questions or overcoming objections. It's about engaging the person and helping them, coming alongside them to help them to navigate through difficult questions. So take your time, right? Number two, don't pretend to be omniscient. I don't know everything. Nobody does other than God. So if somebody's, asks you a question, if they stump you with something, it's okay to say, you know what, I don't know. Let me think about that and come and get back to you. I've read up on it, or maybe I haven't read up on it. Let me go read up on it and come back to you. The last thing you want to do is pretend to be a know-it-all. You don't have to be that. I'm saying the salvation of the individual you're dealing with doesn't rest on your shoulders. Ultimately, it's the responsibility of the Holy Spirit. It's the initiative of the Holy Spirit that's going to draw them anyway. So you got to take the burden off your shoulders. You don't have to be omniscient. And lastly, real quick, don't confuse a rebuttal with a refutation. Don't confuse a rebuttal with a refutation. And what I mean by that is, just because somebody disagrees with you, or just because they give you a counterpoint, doesn't mean that they've defeated your point. It just means that they disagree and they've made a counterpoint, right? So don't get discouraged just because you get pushback. That's all right. You know what I'm saying? Jesus, when he walked the earth, he got pushed back all the time from the Pharisees, from his own disciples, right? You don't have to be intimidated by pushback, because at the end of the day, we stand on the gospel, we stand on his truth. And along those lines, I want to end out here. We'll come back to this. There's some sources I want to point out. Don't underestimate the power of the gospel. Okay. You might not even need to get to, the apologetic side of it. It's okay if you share the gospel and a person comes to Christ. Don't spend time on the Kalam cosmological argument. get them to the cross if at all possible. And I've made this acronym here for gospel. Go out, share the promise of eternal life. Get your hands dirty. Get out there and share the gospel. And I want to leave out with my man, Bishop D.A. Payne from the AME Zion Church, who in his memoirs wrote this. He says, he ends it towards the end of it. He says this: "Let my science bow down before thee and become consecrated by thee. Let my philosophy kiss thy feet as Mary kissed the feet of Jesus, and be enlightened by thine unerring, thine immortal truth." I want to make sure that as we're studying all this stuff, the Bible talks about how knowledge puffs up. You don't want to be that way. We want to make sure that we're not getting puffed up in the things that we study, but our studies of science and philosophy should always be submitted to Christ. I mean, we're to take all thoughts captive, even when you're thinking about apologetics. It should all be submitted to Christ, and as we endeavor to seek his truth and articulate that truth to others. So that being said, I'll yield for some questions.
Brother. Man, that I think just this last segment here, I think you just unpacked a lot, and I thank you. Go ahead. Well, by the way, go ahead, bring in your questions. We're going to have about 15-20 minutes of Q&A. We got some good time here. Thank you so much, brother. That was just helpful, and you unpacked a lot of just practical stuff. And you all see right there, he's put his stuff up there, so you can go ahead and subscribe right there to his YouTube channel, the podcast, things like that. If you want to support our brother even financially, donate. Let me tell you, and you all know this type of studying and all of that, it takes time and energy and effort, and it takes money and resources. So please consider contributing to our brother there at his Patreon. So let's go ahead and get some questions in. Britt, thank you. Britt said this was really good. Thank you.
You want me to take this down for the questions? I can take it. I don't know if it's still showing on the screen or not, but I can take it down.
I think it is still up. You can leave it up, brother. It's up to you, man. It's no problem.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. But yeah, let's go ahead and get questions coming in. Any questions that you have, please bring your questions in. But brother, that was just, I love how you brought it to just that the practical aspect, bringing all of this practically, how do we engage people, and just the things that you mentioned, listening and things like that. It was definitely helpful. And then also just giving us this sense of understanding where people are at. Go ahead and put your questions in there, everyone. Put your questions. Let's start with, I think, Daniel, can you put that gospel slide back up? He was asking about that acronym. What does that mean? Somebody asked about that.
What does it mean? Oh, yeah. It's just, maybe somebody else will come up with it, but I was just kind of walking down the street one day and this popped in my head as far as taking the gospel and making it an acronym. This go out and share the promise of eternal life, and what I was saying there was that, this is, put it this way, evangelizing should be in the DNA of a disciple of Christ. It should be a lifestyle. It should be something that we're all engaging in. And so one thing I was just encouraging people just is on a practical level when dealing with atheists, don't be scared to share the gospel. Don't be scared to share the gospel. You don't have to feel like just because they don't believe it that, the Bible says the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. Do not underestimate the power of the gospel. I had a guy I was dealing with this back when I was in college, and I was just preaching. This is way before I was really into apologetics. I was just preached the gospel to him. You know what I'm saying? And he came back like a year later. Now, mind you, when I preached it to him, he said unless God appears to him in a burning bush in his apartment, that he would not become a Christian. This same dude called me a year later and said he had given his life to Christ. You know what I'm saying? So I'm just saying you can't. He was a hardcore atheist. You can't underestimate the power of the gospel.
Yes.
Yeah.
And brother, that's excellent. And I love how tying into that, how you said really walking with people and taking that time, because at times a lot of people are unchurched today, far away from understanding Christian faith and the gospel. So it's going to take time. And so we don't have to feel that pressure of feeling like it got to be a one-shot gospel presentation and twist their arm into saying a sinner's prayer. So that's good, brother. Yeah. Here's a question here for you. So you talked about, and I thought this was bars, you said you cannot build a strong community on a foundation of weak ideas. That was good. And so and you talked about, so here we are in our society, broader culture, there's a lot of call for justice, crying for justice, especially amongst our millennials and Gen Z, our younger crowd. So call for justice and social reform and things like that. Yeah. Can you break it down a little bit more as far as how would you engage a person that is rejecting the Christian faith, leaning towards atheism or professing to be an atheist, and yet they want to do justice and all of that? How would you practically, engage them and walk with them to help them see that their worldview is bankrupt and that they really can't adequately call out for justice and reform and things like that with the atheistic worldview? And then how would you bring them to see that the Christian worldview and the scriptures, specifically on justice and reform, is just a lot better?
Oh, good. Yeah. So actually, that gives me the opportunity to go here. This book right here, Tactics by Greg Koukl. It's basically, this is a must-have for anybody engaged in apologetics, because basically what Greg Coleman does in Tactics is he's not just giving you arguments, but he tells you the conversational tools so that you can put the arguments to work. You know what I'm saying? And he shows you how you can use questions to guide conversations and things of that nature. So if you're in that kind of conversation, this book right here, I would highly recommend that people get it, because it'll kind of give you a game plan. Now, with that being said, one of my, I guess, kind of go-to moves, if you will, is I really believe that if I'm arguing with somebody, if I'm having a disagreement, if I can show you how your worldview is at conflict with itself, then that's going to be more potent than me telling you that you're wrong. Because then at that point, you're arguing with your worldview rather than arguing with me. So for example, if I'm talking with somebody about just, morality, is it, if they believe that morality is subjective, or they don't have some sort of, they're atheists and they, concede, that objective morality doesn't exist or something like that, then I'm going to, one of the ways I do is what's called the time machine approach. So I'll say, okay, well, let's say that if you could take a time machine and go back to the 1800s, where, you're on a plantation and you see one of our ancestors being beaten and raped, you know what I'm saying? Could you look that ancestor in the eye and tell them that what's happening to them is not objectively wrong? I'm saying, could you do that? Right. And the answer is generally no. I've tried it a couple of times, I'm saying, and some people are just like, whatever. But it's because it really cuts at those intuitions. I'm saying it shows you how, your moral framework doesn't work, I'm saying, when it's put into actual practice, right? And so so likewise, I mean, now you want to be sensitive because, I mean, it's not like, so for example, I mean, we all witnessed the murder of George Floyd, a couple of weeks ago. Now, that would not have been a time where you want to just run up on somebody with, hey, man, if you think that was wrong, then I'm saying, you don't want to do that. You know what I mean? But you can point to some cases where if there's some emotional distance and people can think rationally about it, you can point to some of these cases like a Trayvon Martin or anybody you want to name. I can be like, look, you know what? The reality is, if God doesn't exist, then there is no objective human value and no lives matter. It's not a matter of whether Black lives matter, all lives matter. No, if there's no God, no lives matter at the end of the day. And you can just kind of walk them through how just basically their worldview can account for what it is that they're trying to claim. And so at very least, it puts a stone in their shoe that they're going to walk away with, and they're going to have to square that. And I think that can be kind of like what the scripture talks about, where one seed is planted, another waters, and then God gives the increase. But I think, did that answer the question, or?
Absolutely, brother.
Okay, yeah. Cool. All right. Yeah.
I think it definitely answered the question and showing how their worldview is deficient. And then you've already laid out how the Christian worldview is just the best worldview. You talked about the image of God and things like that. And so I think you answered it. Let's get some more questions. We got about 10 more minutes. So let's get some questions coming in. Type your questions in the chat. Here's one question here, brother, that you can respond to. How do you respond to Black people who believe in God, but not the Trinity? And so they're saying that they believe in some type of God, but not the Trinity, particularly people who doubt that Jesus is the Son of God. It's a little off topic for today, but okay. We're waiting on some questions. You got a brief response to that?
Yeah, briefly. Well, I would refer people to the video we talked about last time, God versus the Wu-Tang Clan, because I deal with how a Unitarian concept of God can account for as strong a moral foundation as a Trinitarian concept of God. And so I would refer people to the God versus Wu-Tang Clan video for a longer explanation of that. But, simply put, I would just say that, okay, if they believe in just, some God of some sort, what is the evidence that their worldview is accurate? What evidence can they provide for that? And then I'm going to provide something like evidence for the resurrection, like we talked about earlier. Because if I can show you that Jesus rose from the grave by the power of God, well, now you got to deal with his teachings. You know what I'm saying? And you can't really get through the Gospels without seeing clear divinity claims if you know anything about how the Hebrews would have read the Gospels. And so you want to just kind of walk them through the Gospels and what the New Testament indicates about Jesus being divine and so on and so forth, and what that really means. So, that resurrection argument is very versatile in being able to get people to directly who God is and why it is that we affirm the Trinity, Jesus is Lord, and things of that nature.
That brother, that is powerful. And again, people, please check out our brother. He has so much content on his Tru-ID Apologetics YouTube page and podcast. Check him out. Check out that episode, God versus the Wu-Tang Clan. And he's getting into so much other content and subjects and things like that. We got a question here, brother. So this is from Daniel Miller, who is sharing that he is a white man. And he says that as a white guy, how can he respectfully, or just white people in general, how can they respectfully relate to Black atheist friends when talking about the gospel? He said, for example, bringing up the basis of saying Black Lives Matter or all lives matter in a conversation or addressing Christianity as the white man's religion. So how can a white person that's engaging Black atheist friends kind of bring up some of the arguments you're talking about and have these tough conversations and things like that, and some of the critiques of their atheistic worldview, but do it in a way that's respectful and loving, compassionate, and tactful?
Yeah, so one of the things, it may be more difficult in some situations than others. First of all, you're gonna take your cues from what sort of relationship you have with that person. If it's like a random person off the street, then you may not necessarily want to go that route. You know what I'm saying? But if it's somebody that you know, that you have a rapport built, you're going to have more equity with that person to deal with some of those sensitive issues. So maybe you can go there. But like I kind of talked about two streams of critique that you get from Black atheists. One had to do with kind of the moral critique, and then the other one had to do with just whether or not it's rational to believe in God. And what you may want to do is, if you're engaging your Black atheist friends, you might want to just stay away from the moral critique side of it for the time being, and then just kind of focus on the more rational arguments for God's existence, because it'll just kind of create some distance between some of the issues that may take the conversation in a direction you don't want it to go. Given the Kalam cosmological argument, I mean, it's kind of like a morally neutral argument. You know what I'm saying? Like, nobody's really going to get ticked off, or I can't imagine, too many ways that it's going to devolve into, addressing racism or whatever. If you're talking about just the existence of the universe, they start with something that's kind of morally neutral, and then kind of work your way from there.
Right. Excellent. Any more questions? Please put your questions in the chat. Again, check out our brother. He has a lot more content. If you're interested in the Surge Evangelism Ministry, email me, jcjones@epiphanyfellowship.org. Would love to answer your questions about the ministry. And if you want to join, we'd be glad to have you. We got a question here from Storm. She says, I use the conversion of James, the brother of Christ, often. How do you convince your sibling that you're God? I'm not sure.
I know what she means. Yeah. So I put the minimal facts argument on the screen. Okay. I've been talking about the argument for the resurrection. And so the minimal facts argument is where historians and philosophers will take the facts that I put on the screen here. And these are things, these aren't just faith statements. You know what I'm saying? For each one of these, you're going to, matter of fact, for the first four, over, I'll say like upwards, maybe about 90% of historians and scholars who work in this area of history would affirm that these four statements are historically factual. You know what I'm saying? Whereas in the fifth one, Jesus' tomb was found empty, between 2/3 and 3/4 would say that it's factual. So either way, you have overwhelming support for these five facts. And then the question is, well, what best accounts for all these five facts? And, no naturalistic explanation has ever been able to fit the bill. But obviously, there's Jesus rising from the dead by the power of God does, resolve this problem, and it can explain all five facts. And so she's looking at fact number 4, the conversion of James as the brother of Jesus, to Christianity. And one of the common things that apologists say is like, what would it take for you to convince your brother or your sister that you were the Lord? You know what I'm saying? Like, so this idea that, so for James to convert to Christianity, there must have been something compelling that would have moved him from being an unbeliever to a follower of Christ after Christ's death, by the way, because we're told that Jesus' siblings, they weren't like followers like that. So what is it that after his death caused him to really believe that Jesus had actually rose from the grave and was the Lord? There must have been some pretty powerful evidence, i.e. his bodily resurrection by the power of God.
That's good, brother. And for some people, we'll take a few more questions. We got about 5 more minutes, so please put your questions in the chat. For some people that the apologetics is new to them, and there is some fear. A lot of Christians, I think fear is up there as far as top 3 hindrances to people engaging in evangelism. And so people may be afraid of the critiques and the arguments of atheists. I think your presentation has helped. And so as they're understanding what you've presented, or they're just starting to read other books and things like that, you mentioned at the end practical things that can be done. What would you say for that believer that's just really afraid and just starting to wrap their mind around some of the position of the atheists and responses and things like that? Yeah. What would you say are some practical things they could do, kind of tying into Greg Koukl and tactics and stuff? Could you walk a new believer through maybe how they would walk through that conversation, like asking questions, understanding things like that?
Okay. Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand where apologetics fits into the life of the believer. Okay. Now, as I see it, I think the apologetics fits into the life of a believer in the areas of evangelism and discipleship. Okay, because you're coming to know more about Christ, you're coming to know more about the world he created, what he's doing in the world, more about his nature and so forth. So as a matter of discipleship, learning more about God, basically loving him with all your mind. That's part of the great commandment, right? The first commandment from Jesus. So discipleship, and then you also have the evangelistic piece. Apologetics is complementary to our efforts as evangelists. You want to equip yourself, as you go out there and share the gospel. So both of those things, we're talking about preparation. I'm saying you want to take your time. You don't have to go out today and start, trying to battle atheists just off this one video, this one live session. Take some time to stock up. Matter of fact, there's some other, where we at here? I listed some other books. I just put up on the screen in case they want to make note of it. But On Guard by William Lane Craig, Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas and Lacona. Look up these works, and as you Google it, you'll see other works that come up, on Amazon, things like that, that'll be very helpful to you. So take time to equip yourself. Now, with that being said, we cannot divorce evangelism, apologetics, discipleship from this spiritual battle that we're in. You know what I'm saying? You have to understand that there is a very real adversary who's it's in his best interest to not have you out there preaching the gospel, right? Now, when you look in the book of Acts, it's very clear that even the Apostle Paul, they would have hands laid on him and have people pray for him so that they would have boldness to go out and preach the gospel. Okay, that Holy Spirit boldness is essential for any believer to get out there and be consistent and just continue on preaching the gospel, giving people this truth and whatnot. So, you know, for anybody who's afraid, just understand that you're not alone. Greater is he that's in you than he that is in the world. Seek the Lord. You know, if you need to pray with some others or whatever, whatever you need to do, but pray for that boldness from the Holy Spirit to get out there and preach the gospel. If God be for you, who can be against you?
Amen. Amen. I think we're coming up on time, and I think that's a good spot to end on. There's more questions coming in. Robin, real quick to Robin, we're going to answer that question. We're going to do a whole session on why trust the Bible, and so stay tuned for that. But as far as for today, we're running out on time. Brother Adam, just any final word that you want to say? I know you've covered a lot, but any last thing you want to say before we close out?
Well, hey, man, I'm just, this is my second session with you guys this summer, man, and I've loved every minute of it. I just want to say thank you again for having me. I encourage my fellow believers to understand that I know there's a lot going on in the world right now. I know it's kind of scary out there right now, but I'll say, at least in my lifetime, there's never been a better time to preach the gospel. You know what I'm saying? People are scared. People don't know where to look to have hope, and we have the answer. You know what I'm saying? I encourage you, get out there, equip yourselves, watch the rest of this Urban Apologetics series here with Epiphany Fellowship. I certainly will be. You know what I'm saying? Y'all will see me in the chat and all that. You know what I'm saying? Equip yourself, get out here and let's get it done, y'all. Let's get out here and preach the gospel, man. Subscribe to me on my YouTube channel. I already put the information up, that kind of stuff. And, you'll get the same thing that you got here, man. I'm out here trying to give people, if there's just one of me, then that's not getting the job done. I want to, give this stuff out so that you guys can take what I'm sharing and go put it to use and let's get these souls, man. That's what it's about.